Have you ever wondered how the sun will end? Will it explode? Will it run out of fuel and just stop shining? Will it turn into a black hole? Well, today we're gonna shed some light over the insane events preceding the deaths of the stars of today's video. Stars. But first, there's something you need to know, because stars are incredibly varied. And in fact, we'll go into some crazy types of stars in this video. But every type of star has a different timeline and a different end. Our sun is a G-type main sequence star. And no, I didn't make that up. Stars are classified into letters O, B, A, F, J, K, and M, depending on their temperature. O are the biggest and hottest, with a surface temperature of at least 33,000 Kelvin and a mass 15 to 90 times the mass of the Sun, while M are the coldest and smallest, with temperatures of at most 3,900 Kelvin. And main sequence stars are basically just the normal ones, the stars that aren't giants, nor white dwarfs, nor neutron stars. Well, anyway, now that that's settled, let's see how stars are born. So there are these things floating around space called nebulae. They're basically regions where interstellar gas and dust clump up due to gravity, and they're absolutely beautiful. Like, look at this, it's the Cat's Eye Nebula. How cool is that? Or this one, the Ring Nebula. Or the Trifid Nebula, which looks like it hasn't decided on who to vote for yet. But enough with the looks, because we're interested in what happens inside them. You see, some of these clumps of material get really big and heavy and eventually collapse into a giant ball. Although this can only happen if the cloud is able to cool down, because if it gets too hot, the photons from the radiation of heat will actually create an outward pressure, preventing the ball from collapsing. However, if this ball gets dense enough, the conditions inside it will be able to get so extreme that fusion of hydrogen will begin. We now have a star. But here's where we reach our first split, because some stars will fall just short of being able to start that fusion chain reaction. These are called brown dwarfs or failed stars, and they're the weird object between the biggest gas giants and the smallest stars, only glowing a bit due to the occasional fusion of deuterium. But let's go back to our normal stars, because they're much more interesting. To understand what's going to happen from now on, we need to know what's happening inside the star. Let's open it up. At the center is the core, and it's basically the place where the temperature and pressure are so extreme that fusion happens. The rest of the star glows incredibly bright as well, so you can imagine how much energy this produces. In fact, it's so much energy that the photons radiated by the core during fusion are actually what prevents the star from just collapsing into a stellar remnant or black hole or whatever. Sort of like with the nebula, but now both the gravity and pressure are just absolutely ginormous. The next layer after the core is the radiative zone, and it's just the zone in which energy is transferred mostly as the aforementioned radiation. This layer is still extremely hot and dense, and as a real fun fact, photons bump into so many particles here that they take an average of 171,000 years just to leave this layer. Outside the radiative zone lies the convective zone, and it's where heat is primarily transferred due to, well, convection. But what happens here is quite interesting, as there's a huge temperature gradient with material getting cooler as you go outward. When hot and less dense gas rises up, it finds even cooler gas, so it keeps rising, creating these massive currents of plasma, which we can actually see as the granulation on the sun's surface. After that, we have the photosphere. This is the first layer of a star's atmosphere, and it's the layer where the plasma stops being opaque, when it's diffuse enough to allow photons through. So it basically defines the visible light we receive from the sun. The second layer of the atmosphere is the chromosphere, and it's basically just the transition between the first one and the last one, the stellar corona. It glows red because of the abundance of hydrogen atoms, which consistently emit photons of red wavelengths as their electron gets excited. Now the stellar corona, the last layer of the atmosphere, and well, of the star, extends very far out, and is made of very dim but actually much harder plasma than the one at the surface. Here is where these amazing solar filaments occur, and coronal mass ejections, I guess. Okay, so now we can start. As soon as a star forms, it quickly stabilizes and enters its main sequence phase. How long a star spends in this phase depends on its mass. from a few million years in O-type stars to hundreds of billions of years in M-type stars. Our Sun, for example, will spend about 10 billion years in this phase. And during this period, just the usual happens. Hydrogen gets fused into helium, and unfathomable amounts of energy are spewed out. However, this means that eventually the star will run out of its hydrogen. And once this happens, fusion in the core will shut down. And remember I told you that the radiation pressure from this fusion is what kept the star puffed up? Well, without it, the star begins to collapse in on itself. However, this creates so much pressure and heat, about 100 million degrees in fact, that the shell of hydrogen outside the core, which is now mainly made of helium, can actually begin fusion. The result of this fusion is again helium, which gets dumped into the core. This increases its gravity, which causes its size to decrease and its pressure and temperature to greatly increase, to the point where it can't be compressed further due to the inability for the electrons to overlap, in a phenomenon known as electron degeneracy pressure. Of course, all of this allows for more fusion, and this hugely increased fusion creates more outward radiation pressure and our star expands. A lot! In fact, it will enter its red giant phase. For the Sun, this will mean a 200-fold increase in radius, completely engulfing Mercury and Venus. But don't think the Earth is spared, oh no, because red giants are so big that the outer layers are barely held by gravity, resulting in an extreme shedding of material. And this material would actually create drag on the Earth's orbit, which would decrease in radius until the Earth would just crash into the Sun. But don't worry, because the Sun won't enter its red giant phase until about 5 billion years from now. We'll probably have gone extinct already because of some TikTok challenge. Nonetheless, our star continues to live, and something crazy happens now. As I said, the hydrogen shell burning is dumping helium into the core, and eventually this reaches a point where the core's pressure becomes so high that helium can actually begin fusing, and this produces carbon and oxygen. This is called the helium flash, and as the core is again producing all that radiation itself, it expands back into a normal, non-degenerate core, and the star's overall size goes back to only about 2 times its original radius, just like the good old days when it was just hydrogen fusing in the core. For the Sun, this helium flash will last about 100 million years. And what happens when the core runs out of helium and there's just carbon and oxygen in there? You guessed it, it turns off, contracts, increases in temperature and pressure, and helium shell burning starts. This, of course, expands the star again, and at this stage, the Sun will expand so much that it will completely engulf Mars. So yeah, if any Martian colonies have survived to this point, they better make a run for it. Or a warp drive leap, I guess. This phase is the asymptotic giant branch, and to understand why, I think it's about time I introduced you to the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. It plots stars in terms of luminosity and color, and it provides more insight than one would expect. For example, we can see all the main sequence stars forming this clear line along the diagram, but also these areas corresponding to other types of stars. However, it can also help us understand stellar evolution. As main sequence stars run out of hydrogen in their core and turn into red giants, we can see that they start moving along this line, the red giant branch. Then, they go along the horizontal branch as they fuse helium in their core, and go on to the asymptotic giant branch in the process I just mentioned. Something cool about these AGB stars is that when the helium shell runs out, another hydrogen shell can still fuse, restocking the helium shell and eventually allowing it to start fusing explosively. And these thermal pulses can happen every 10,000 to 100,000 years and decrease in frequency as the star approaches its end. But eventually, all this hydrogen and helium fuel runs out, and the star contracts one last time, its outer layers being shed and the rest, about 60% of its mass, collapsing into a degenerate core that we call a white dwarf. These outer layers will form a planetary nebula, which will temporarily glow due to the extreme energies of the radiation emitted by the newly collapsed core. But the white dwarf will eventually settle down. But wait, why is it still glowing? Simple. The sheer thermal energy it contains right now will keep it shining for so long that in the 13.8 billion years the universe has existed for, we haven't spotted, and don't expect to see, a single black dwarf. That is, a white dwarf that has cooled down to the point of ceasing to glow. The fate of stars doesn't really change much as you go down in mass. Although, for the smallest M-type stars, the red giant branch may be completely skipped and the star can last trillions of years just very slowly fusing hydrogen into helium until eventually it just turns into a simple helium white dwarf. Of course, not that we'll ever get to witness it, but just some cool info for you. Now, this is where it actually gets interesting. O and B-type stars, the most massive ones, fuse really quickly. So quickly, in fact, that their lifespan can be as low as a few tens of millions of years or even just a few 100,000 years. And this means that they exit the main sequence phase really quickly. And when they do, they can actually just start fusing helium directly without the need for electron degeneracy pressure or a helium flash. It just kind of gradually starts, making the star increasingly brighter than it already was, and this increased radiation pressure actually causes the star to expand into a supergiant. And these supergiants aren't called like that for nothing. Red supergiants are actually the largest stars in the entire universe, with radii of up to about 1,500 times the Sun's radius. Like, just think about that number, 2 billion kilometers. That would engulf Jupiter's orbit. Even more massive stars are so massive and bright that the radiation pressure sheds the cooler outer layers before a red supergiant can even form, leaving only the hotter parts and creating a blue supergiant that is even hotter, brighter, and often more massive than red supergiants. But you thought we couldn't get more extreme? Enter hypergiants. These absolute behemoths of the universe are defined as the very brightest and thus most massive stars in existence. They shed unfathomable amounts of material in huge stellar winds and form from stars even more massive than the ones that stay as supergiants, starting at about 40 solar masses. The brightest star in the universe is a blue hypergiant called, wait for it, LGGS J004246.86 plus 413336.4. Anyway, the biggest one is actually a red supergiant called UY Scuti, with a radius of 1,700 times the Sun's. Why supergiant and not hypergiant? Well, remember that hypergiants are in terms of luminosity, and red stars are much dimmer. Unfortunately, these stars fuse so incredibly fast that their lifespan barely surpasses the few million years. But when they die, we get the cool stuff. For stars with 10 to 25 solar masses, when they reach the end of their lives, the core is so incredibly dense that the electron degeneracy pressure is overcome and it collapses further. This will happen for any white dwarf exceeding the Chandrasekhar limit, about 1.4 solar masses. And as this collapse happens, electrons are forced into protons, and in a process known as electron capture, they form neutrons, along with a shockwave of neutrinos that explosively pushes all material outward in a supernova. Our star turns into a neutron star, a kind of atomic nucleus the size of a star that is one of the densest and most extreme objects in the entire universe. But if a star is so massive that its remnant exceeds the Tolman-Oppenheimer Volkov limit, about 3 to 4 solar masses, not even the degeneracy pressure of neutrons is enough to prevent further collapse. In a runaway process, our star becomes a black hole, an anomaly of spacetime of infinite density and absolutely bizarre characteristics, which definitely deserves its own video. As a fun fact, due to time dilation, you never actually see the event horizon forming. You just see the material collapsing more and more slowly until it just freezes and gets redshifted into oblivion. So quick shout out to all my subscribers, thank you so much. We finally reached 300 subscribers. Let's keep it up and see if we can reach the 500 mark. Anyway, now you know how your home star will end, even if you're in another solar system. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.